if you were to get like 1 to 200 probably new followers in a 48-hour period, just after you launch your show, you would most probably get into the top 10 in the UK or in the US in the marketing category. But the beauty is we then use that as social proof as we're going out.
Tom, welcome to the show, Squire. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thank you, Sam. How are you?
Not too bad, my friend. Not too bad for a Friday afternoon. Gearing up for the weekend and looking forward to what's hopefully going to be an interesting podcast. We're going to be talking all about how our audience can start their own podcast that's actually going to make them real money, real revenue, real cash in the bank. So first and foremost, Tom, I thought podcasts was like a really flooded market these days. Isn't it really hard to drive revenue through them?
Yeah, you're totally right. I think to understand the flooded market question, I find quite interesting because I would totally agree. More people are starting podcasts, but the market, if that's actually not the metric, it's a combination of two metrics, which is how many podcasts there are and how many people that are listening. And
right.
So for it to be flooded, that ratio of number of podcasts and number of listeners has to change. And I'm not sure if it is because yes, more people are starting podcasts, but also more people are listening to podcasts. And so I would maybe disagree with the premise of the question, but we can still talk about how even if the market was flooded and you're not going to get that many listeners for your show, you can still make money from it. So we can dig into that, which may be what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. I'd love to get actionable, and so you can help everyone kind of position their podcast. So like you say, it's not necessary to worry about those metrics, but to worry about how it's actually going to be a useful resource and get them revenue. So are we saying that podcasts are still worth doing today?
I think if I was a head of marketing at a B2B company and we didn't have a podcast, I would start one, but it wouldn't be for the reason that most of the audience or you might be thinking now, Sam.
Okay.
The reason, the number one reason for me as the marketer, for me as the head of marketing, would be to actually learn about these people that we're trying to sell to. Now, this actually happened in 2019. I was head of marketing at a B2B SaaS company, and I joined. And marketers may know when you join, you have to understand who the customer personas are, and then like create your strategy of how you're going to sell to these people. I saw this new type of person I thought we should sell to. We sold sales software, and this person was sales operations. I was like, these are the perfect buyers. But they wasn't really focused for the company, and so no one really knew about them apart from this one sales guy called Henry. So me and Henry were like, why don't we start a podcast focused on sales operations? Because if I was just reaching out to these people trying to get them on a call with me so I could learn about them, but obviously they ignored me. But when we said, hey, would you like to come on Sales Ops Demystified, which was the name of the show, and suddenly we had our ideal customers coming into our office to get interviewed. This is before COVID. And I then went on to host 150 episodes of this podcast, right? And so my like sales ops knowledge, I've never done the role, but I think it's like pretty significant. And I feel like now I could sell to a sales ops person much more effectively. So I think that's like the hidden benefit of a podcast that can make it profitable.
Got it. So you went from like almost a noob in the area to being an industry expert just by running a podcast.
and like industry expert, but then like the other benefit, and we can talk about this as well, is like I became like famous in the sales ops world. I go to like sales events in London, and then there'll either be someone I'd interviewed or someone in sales ops who'd like listen to the show.
Yep.
And so that has like power when people know you and you don't know them. You have this kind of status over them, which makes it easier to sell.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, let's jump into it. Let's talk about some of the key benefits, some of the key reasons, and you've split a few there of why it is. Because I'm sure and I've talked to a lot of kind of marketers, business owners, you name it, about giving them recommendations of starting a podcast. But I think a lot of common issues I hear, and you can raise some as well, Tom, is that it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of resources. It's going to take a lot of energy and these kind of things. But perhaps we should address those with what the pluses are, and then maybe we can talk about kind of how you go about it in a smart way.
Yeah. So I like to break down the ROI from a podcast from the guest side and the listener side. And so we focus well, most people think they're going to start a podcast, they're going to be Joe Rogan in like 3 months, because they're projecting they're going to get the ROI from the massive audience base they're going to build on the listener side, even if their show is just about even like a tiny part of sales operations, not even that niche, right? And that's just unrealistic. But what actually happens, and what happened in the sales ops example, is in the short term, we're actually more likely to derive an ROI from that guest side. So I'll jump back into the sales ops story. So we'd done about 10 interviews. Like things were going quite well, very like low level production, but I was learning about our guest persona. And then they were sharing on LinkedIn, so we're getting a little bit of social engagement. We also put this is good for you guys. We also put every episode on our blog, so we're getting a little bit of inbound SEO.
Yeah.
And then something magical happened, and the VP of Sales Ops, I won't say the name of the company, but it's a B2B SaaS company everyone knows, came on the show, did a great interview, and then randomly got chatting with the CEO of that company, my employer, after that, and then 4 months later, bought all of their sales team, 183 salespeople, our sales software. And so that gave like a 9 to 10x ROI on all the time and money we spent on the podcast. And so then obviously the business was like very happy with the show, and they were like double down, make it more frequent. And so now that wasn't the initial intention, but what happens when you're like actually learning about people that could be your buyers, building those relationships, the good things will happen in the future, whether that's through partnerships or through customers.
Right.
And so you can't pitch your guests, but you can build relationships with people that if they need your thing in the future, they may come to you, or if they would be a good partner, they could be. And so that's in the short term where we look to the ROI. And this is so important because you're not going to get the ROI from the listener side unless you are consistent for like 6 to 12 months. So this is why it's so important to look for the ROI, because you get the CFO. He's never going to cut the podcast budget if you have like 2 people in the sales pipeline from it in the first 3 months or 6 months.
Gotcha. And I think I made a similar mistake as well when I started this podcast, is purely because I didn't have the expertise or the knowledge, that I thought, yeah, listeners are the way to go. And I need to maximize listeners, promote the heck out of the show in any means possible, whether that's email, social media, paid ads, getting guests to promote it. When in fact, like you say, Tom, it's actually pretty difficult from my experience anyway to build up that listenership fast. So what you're saying there is an interesting approach. So are you recommending people that are new to podcast focus on what you've just described there? So actually interview their ideal fit clients, learn about those as the starting point. So
use it to learn. And then also to build relationships. And if you're happy just running the show for those 2 benefits, amazing. Because then the listener stuff can come a bit later. And at the same time, you're creating a load of content that you can use for all your other purposes. So that is what I recommend. I would actually say that a podcast is not a good way of building an audience. It's an incredible way of building a relationship with an existing audience. So if you're looking to get like more brand awareness or attention fast, then I'd probably look at other strategies, like maybe like potentially even just an email newsletter, and then like LinkedIn organic posting. That combination would probably work best. And then after 6 months, when you've got like 3K people on the email list, when you've got up to like 10K followers on LinkedIn, you launch a podcast, then you're actually gonna you should be able to spike up into the top of Apple in marketing category, for example, rather than starting the podcast first.
Gotcha. So before we get into some actionables of some of the kind of core things people need to think about when they're setting up a show for their brand, for their business, what are some of the biggest mistakes? We've talked about a couple, but what are some of the massive do not do's before you get stuck in and start building one? Yeah, 3. The first one is going too broad. So the best example of this is like the email marketing software company. They're starting a podcast and they have 3 options. Option 1 is to start a podcast about marketing. Option 2 is to start a podcast about email marketing. And option 3 is to start a podcast about open rates. Here, I would always recommend, depending on the budget, if we were talking to MailChimp, then maybe we would go for option 1 or option 2. If it's any company with like less than 50 employees and less than like 100 grand for the podcast for the year, I would say we'd start the email open rate podcast, because in 3 to 6 months, in theory, we are going to be the number 1 email open rate podcast. It's going to be so much easier to grow in the early stages if you're more specific. And then once you've reached that
the heights of the email marketing open rates podcast, then you can set your sights on like email marketing and then ultimately marketing. So it's getting the niche right at the start.
Okay.
It's so important. Number 2 is, as we've already covered, is not being strategic about guests in the early days.
Right.
As we said before, ROI in the short term is going to come from guests, whether it's partnerships or customers. And then number 3 is simply not being consistent. And if you get number 1 and 2 right, it's likely that you will stay consistent because you'll see the listeners grow because you're like perfectly niched. It's going to be easier to find listeners, so that keeps you motivated. And then if you're strategic about guests, if you have people, partners, or customers in the sales pipeline because you build relationships with them, or even like someone that came on as a guest, you built a great relationship with them, and they referred someone to you, right? So it doesn't even have to be the person that came on, but you're networking, right? You're adding value to people in your industry. But if that happens in the first 6 months and you have 1 or 2 people come into the process, again, you're not stopping and you'll be consistent. So 3 is almost the result of 1 or 2.
Gotcha. What is, in your opinion, what's like is there a perfect amount of show episodes that you should put out, i.e. X per month, X per week?
The maximum amount at which you can maintain quality. So just like going to the gym, you're going to get stronger or faster by doing it more consistently, but only if those sessions are good. So if you are unable to maintain the right quality at weekly, then we would recommend bi-weekly, and same for bi-weekly versus monthly.
Yep, got it. So making sure it's actually decent stuff that you're putting out rather than trying to rush out as many as you possibly can. So let's say a few of our listeners, a few of our watchers are thinking, "Oh, this sounds okay so far, Tom. How do I put this into place? You've told us what we shouldn't do. How can we? Are there some kind of first steps before we start lining up our own niche? Before we're thinking about that, our own industry niche around our sector, around what we're actually selling, before we start signing up guests, what are some of the first considerations before you jump in and invite people on?"
Yeah, so the niche is the number 1 thing to consider. Once you've done that, I think guests would be second. So understanding who is going to be a first guest. Typically, when you don't have a show live, it's going to be the hardest of all time to book guests. So typically, I would aim to bring on people that you know already. And if you've been in your industry for a while, I'm sure that'll be very obvious. Also, if you want to bring on bigger people, I would typically wait until you've launched and like leverage your connections first for the launch. So once you have positioning agreed, once you have guests, there's a load of like small things you need to do, like what's the name of the show, what's the visual design of the podcast thumbnail, what's the intro, what's the outro script, what's the structure of these episodes, and then the technology. So what software are you going to use to book in the guest? What software are you going to use to host the show? Where are you going to write your show notes, etc. So those are all like small things. If you Google like how to start a podcast, there's a lot of blog posts telling you how to do that. But I think like the absolutely crucial thing is positioning, and then your first guest. And then all the other stuff, like I think people try to make it seem like it's complex, but really a podcast is just an RSS feed with audio files instead of written, just like a blog is, right? So yeah, I think it's quite simple to launch, but getting the positioning right and then getting the guest right is probably the most important 2 things.
When you say positioning, tell us more about what that means exactly.
Yeah, so it's like the email open rate podcast versus the email marketing podcast. So what category is your show fitting into? So getting that right is super important.
Got it. Okay, so focus on that niche, focus on that category, focus on that positioning. Start with interviewing people that you already know, so it's an easy ask. How do you build it up, Tom, once you've perhaps got a few guests? Then I guess if you're going niche and if you're thinking of this show as the go-to for something very specific, so like you were saying, their email open rates to start with, once you've invited perhaps a few clients or close contacts, how do you ramp it up so then you can interview, let's say, target ideal clients, people that you eventually maybe want to do building business with and build relationships with? Yeah,
so the launch of the show is like the big opportunity to get that social proof. The way we're going to get like perfect guests, whether they're famous or whether they're ideal customers or ideal partners, is because you have social proof around the show. Now, if somebody's reaching out asking you to be on a podcast, there's probably a couple of things you're looking at. You want to know who else has been on the show, and you want to try and estimate how popular the show is.
Yep.
So what we're going to do at launch is we're just going to maximize all the effort we have in getting as many new followers and downloads in Apple Podcasts specifically as possible.
Right.
So we're going to choose the category. So Apple categories are not actually that ideal with our email marketing open rate podcast, we would have to be in the marketing category, which is in business in Apple Podcasts. There's nothing more niche than that. But if you were to get like 1 to 200 probably new followers in a 48-hour period, just after you launch your show, you would most probably get into the top 10 in the UK or in the US in the marketing category.
Okay.
And so one thing in the top 10, obviously that'll bring us more downloads because we're sat there, people doing discovery will come to our show, which is great. But the beauty is we then use that as social proof as we're going out. So ideally, some of our early contacts are like big names as well. Let's say we get the biggest LinkedIn influencer that talks about open rates on our show because we've liked a few of his posts. He likes us. He comes on. He's like, yeah, I'll do it. But there's 3 other big players that would also be ideal customers. So
right.
you release the episode with Jason. He's the big name. We get number 7 in the US in marketing and Apple Podcasts. We then script our outreach messages to these guys being like, hey, we have the second most downloaded email marketing open rate podcast. Jason has been on, and currently we're in the top 10 in marketing podcasts in the US. Do you have a spare 45 minutes? And so then by month 3, we'd have had the 3 biggest names in the email marketing open rates. 2 out of the 3 have shared it for us. 1 out of the 3 wrote a blog post on their blog about our podcast. Well, we actually wrote it, but they posted it for us. And so we're linking back to the show from that. And we're like well on the way to being the most downloaded email marketing podcast the world has ever seen.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's leveraging the initial hit of traffic to the show, getting it up in the charts and Apple Podcasts, and then using that as social proof along with the guests that you've had on your outreach to then get those ideal clients on board.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast recently called Acquired, and what they do is they basically study tech companies and acquisitions. And they're like business nerds, and they're trying to analyze how companies do well. And something they've been saying recently is that strength builds on strength. And so all these big companies, they basically did something well once, and they just leverage that for the next thing, then leverage that for the next thing. So that's exactly how you want to view this process. We want to do one thing well, which is we got Jason on the show. To do the launch well, we get to number 7 in marketing. We leverage that to get the next 2 big name guests in email marketing open rates. And then we just leverage that to become the number 1 most downloaded email marketing podcast. So it really is that like just going step by step and then leveraging the result or the social proof from the previous step in order to get to the next one.
Got it. So Tom, what are some of the best ways to actually market podcast in your opinion?
Yeah. So let's go back to the story. So we've now released our episodes with the two people. There are other big names. We have Jason's episode as well, but there's one other email marketing open rate podcast, which we know has got like 3 times as many downloads per month of us. So the question is, how do we get to number 1, right? Like most podcast promotion strategies, you can Google like how to promote a podcast and you'll find them all as like, get the video snippets, post the video snippets, make sure you're tagged correctly in Apple Podcasts. And so I don't think we need to go through that, but I think so instead we're going to go through 3 things that I don't really talk about much because this is like the secret sauce, but I'm going to share them here. The first one is, I think, the biggest opportunity for attention in general in the B2B world right now is LinkedIn organic posting. And so what I would recommend for the host of this show is and there's a new thing that influencer profiles can do on LinkedIn is I see you have it, Sam, is put the URL to something just below your description on your profile. So putting the podcast there with a bit of social proof. So we're saying number 2 most downloaded email marketing open rates podcast. That's probably a bit long for the text they added, but you get my point. And then we're going to be writing probably as many as we can to maintain quality, posts that are just focused on email marketing open rates. They don't have any links. They can have images or videos embedded, but no links in the post, or even there's no CTA. It's just to add value on LinkedIn. And we're just doing that without even really talking about the podcast. And then that's just we'll get more engagement on this post. We'll get more profile views, and that will drive traffic back to our show. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. A little bit complex, so you obviously have to have like controversial or interesting opinions about the market, but we're an expert in this field, so it's fine. So that's the first one. The second one we're going to do is, I don't know if you remember, but like 5 to 7 years ago, you could pay an Instagram influencer like $50 to get them to post your ecom product to their 100,000 followers because they didn't know their value, right?
Right.
This is happening right now, but in the world of podcasting. So if you were to Google best email marketing podcasts, there'll be like 30 within the top 4 pages on Google. There'll be like maybe 30, maybe a bit less than that, 20 blog post, a blogger's just trying to pick up like this traffic for their blog, and they don't know how valuable that is for us as podcasters. So what we're going to do is we're going to build the list, extract the list of 20 blog posts that are getting some traffic for that, and then we're going to do deals to get our show included. So those deals could include maybe getting that blogger onto our show as a guest. It could include doing a link exchange between their blog and our blog. It could exchange us just paying them. And so if we do this and we get 7 out of the top 20, including us, then, well, ideally more than that, then we're just going to be capturing that inbound traffic over time.
Nice.
And what you'll find is that you're going to get that for very cheap. For now. I mean, in a year, maybe not. But so that's number 2.
Interesting. Okay.
It's a good one, right?
I've not heard that
so
one
we
before.
do this, yeah, exactly. This is like because this is not the stuff you're going to get in the blog post. Number 3, and we already kind of mentioned it already, is obviously guest sharing is like a big thing. Now, so the question is, and any like podcast expert is going to tell you that. But the question is, how do you maximize the amount of times the guest shares, and also maximize the number of places in which they share? And so what we're going to do when one of these email marketing open rate experts is booking into our Calendly link for the show, we put a question there saying, if we were to write up an incredibly insightful blog post summary of the episode, a standalone blog post that talks about what you said in the episode, would you be happy to post it on your blog? Yes or no? We'll find that maybe 60-70% of the people will say yes. And so as well as creating the content we do from the episode, we're also going to create this 500 to 800 word blog post that like really captures the essence of the episode, but also makes the guest look good. We then send that to the guest. The guest posts that on their blog. We get the backlink because we're going to link back to the show. We're probably also going to link back to our domain. So we're going to get the backlink. And I know you like that, Sam, because you're in the SEO game.
Love the SEO tips, yeah.
And then what also happens is typically when a company puts a new blog post live, it gets like put into their social posting schedule, right? Maybe even automatically. So that almost guarantees the share, and also will get the share from their business that you might not get because ideally they're going to share personally anyway. So those are the 3 that are like on top of the standard podcast promo stuff that you read in any blog post site that are working. I think the hottest promo strategy is working right now.
Nice. So let me say something, Tom. I like those tips. I mean, especially like the second one, is that's a bit more unusual in terms of actually doing that Google search on the top X podcast, top category name podcast, and then approaching those people that have written those blogs and trying to get your show on there. It's like you said, that's a nice way to capture that traffic for people that are actively searching for podcasts in your market. So I like that. You did something a bit unusual when you reached out to us to come on the show, because we get a ton of guest requests since the show's grown, as I'm sure you do and many other shows do. And most of them I ignore because they're just like 1,000 words, send me to sleep. Whereas you actually did something a bit different. I think you said at the end of your request, it was quite short and snappy, but you said we'd spend like $50 or $100 actively promoting the show, which I think is the first guest that's ever done that. And I was like, well, that's good, because most of the time I have to nag guests to actually help promote the show, whereas you're actively saying we'll help you promote it. So that in itself, after checking out your LinkedIn, I thought, yeah, let's get him on. We haven't done a podcast specialized show in a while. So let's talk a bit about that, Tom. Are there any ways using paid rather than organic that you've seen shows get some good growth through? Yeah.
So being a guest on other shows in your niche, and then at the end of the podcast saying, yeah, I also have a podcast, is a solid way to promote your own show in its own right. I guess that is also a paid strategy if you offer the paid spend as you go on other people's shows, you're right. But yeah, for paid. Now, we split it in 2 categories, like paid social and then paid on other podcasts. I don't really have much expertise of buying ads on other podcasts yet. Maybe we'll have them more in the future.
Sure.
But in terms of paid social, I'll just go through a couple of strategies.
Sure.
Now, the first one, and this applies to any platform in which you can target just iOS users. What you can do, and this is just for the CTA, we'll talk about targeting and creative later, but you can create a deep link into Apple Podcasts. And so if you're targeting only iOS users, then only iOS people are going to be able to click this, so it's fine. And what happens when people click this link is it will, whether on desktop or mobile, open Apple Podcasts, and then it will pop up a little subscribe button, and it's just a one-click subscribe. And so that, if you're running any paid on a platform in which you can target just iOS, I always recommend that, because you get the subscription, they now call it a follow on Apple Podcasts, before anything else.
Oh, so nice. So it literally opens it and they have to click the subscribe button.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So that's like a little hack. Now, let's talk about creatives and strategies. The most effective paid podcast spend I've ever seen is actually really simple. It was just, it's one of our clients, but they do this in-house, so I can't take credit for it. All they've done, well, actually, it almost goes back to the podcast strategy part. Their show, it isn't really B2B. They basically, each episode targets a health condition. And so diabetes, for example. And so then they have quite good paid targeting. This is Facebook and Instagram, by the way, for those, because then you just target the people in the right geography, in the right age, or that have an interest of that condition. So almost a bit of a gift. But all they do is that they'll have a doctor as the guest, and they'll have just a quote image with the doctor's face, doctor's name, and an interesting quote from the episode. And then it's literally just follow us on Apple Podcasts. But the quote is obviously relevant to them and their condition. And they use that link that we just spoke about. And
Got it.
They're running like pretty high spend on that, and it is absolutely crushing.
Just like a super targeted, super focused image with a caption, and then that links through to the show.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they're a bit lucky because it's very easy targeting for that. One we did recently. Yeah. A different one we did recently is actually in the crypto space. We have a show, and some of the guests are like the founders of relatively like well-known projects. And so for every episode anyway, we're pulling out the best clips for organic posting. So what we'll do, we'll post, let's say, 5 to 10 organic clips over the space of 2 weeks after the episode goes live. We pick the 1 to 3 that get the most engagement organically. And then we take them, and then this is actually on Twitter, because that's the place for crypto, is we'll run that Twitter ad to people who are, because we can't actually run it to people's followers, but we can run it to people that are like either connected to or like interested in, similar to the followers of the people of that person and that project. So if it's a founder of, let's say, Aave, which is a crypto project, we'll run the ad to people that are similar to the followers of Aave and also similar to the followers of that guest.
Right.
If we could run it to the followers of those, it would be ideal, but we can't. So they don't let you do that anymore. And so it's just putting, again, like an interesting, controversial, insightful piece of content in front of them, and then having a clear CTA to go and subscribe.
Have you done much in the way of LinkedIn ads? I see some B2B tech companies are doing quite a bit on repurposing podcasts, putting out kind of video snippets, and then getting that in front of their ICP, their ideal client profile, through LinkedIn ads. Have you done much of that, or is that? Yeah,
I haven't really done that, but I know that Chris Walker of Refine Labs technique there is, because they pull, similar to that, the Twitter technique we just shared, they pull a shitload, or maybe I can't say, of video snippet videos, find the ones that they're best performing, and then just run those to like the top 100,000 accounts. So I think that would work, especially he's a really good talker. So
helps if you've got something good to say, as always with many podcasts, which I occasionally do. Now, that's great. We had a question come in. We don't often take questions, but we had a question in as we're streaming LinkedIn Live. Someone was asking how you can actually measure the podcast, how you can measure audience info, i.e. how many listeners you're getting, the demographics, those kind of things. Any recommended tools for that, Tom?
Yeah, there's probably 3 metrics I would recommend tracking. So I'll go through them and the tools you use. First, if ultimately the goal here on the listener side is to add value to as many people that could be buyers as possible, the best metric to see this is a consumption metric, which really is downloads. And when we say downloads, we mean streams, plays, listens, and downloads, like from all directories. So your podcast host will likely collate all the information from all these platforms, some even do YouTube, and then you'll just have the download number in your podcast host. So we track that, obviously, and we like to see that go up 10% every month. That's healthy. We see that's without paid spend. It could be a bit faster with paid spend. So that's the number 1 metric, like how many people and how many episodes of our show are they consuming? Downloads. Second is followers. We only track this over the 3 largest directories, Apple, Spotify, and Google. Your podcast host won't bring that in, so you have to go and have your access a listing of your show on those places, and then just track followers. Again, we want to see that going up about 5% a month without any paid spend. So we just add those numbers up and track that. The third is, and Apple is the only platform that gives you this, is episode consumption. So they say during a time period, what's the average amount of each episode that's been listened to? And so what we do each month is we add up all of those and then take the average. So we have the average amount of all episodes that have been listened to in that month. And what we want to see then is that just slowly increasing over time as we are making the episodes slightly better, like slightly better hosting, slightly better guests, slightly better editing. And so if we see that going up over time, then probably the download and follower metrics will come as more people are retaining and more people are listening to more of the episodes. So those are the 3 that we recommend.
Got it. And is there a tool that you should use? I know you said for followers, you need to go into the individual platform like Apple and Spotify for things like checking your downloads, consumption. Is that something you can do in your general podcast uploader, or is there specific tools and software that you should try out?
Yeah, so any podcast hosting software will show you downloads. So and there's a lot of them out there.
Cool. Right. We've covered a lot. A lot of this has been around kind of promoting the show, getting the audience there. We talked quite a lot at the start about getting ideal clients onto the show, for going niche into the category that you're really honed in on, and then perhaps expanding it from there and building relationships with those guests. But what are the best ways to make sure that these relationships are actually turning into profitable revenue for our business? Yeah,
it's super interesting here, right? Because the more you try to control that, almost the least effective you're going to be. We've been experimenting with different ways to try to make that happen over the years. And we've kind of come to the conclusion that we kind of just want to make sure the guest has the best possible experience. And then maybe at some point in the future, when weeks or months after, if there's a relevant reason to reach out about some problem that you can solve for them, then you can do that. That's absolutely fine. It could be you or someone from your sales team. But we just want to make sure that the guest leaves the whole experience just being those guys are professional, interesting, and competent. Because then if we somehow are able to understand how we can help them solve a problem and we reach out, then they're more likely to say yes. But at the same time, they're going to be more likely to recommend us to their friends. Or when the company ultimately needs that problem solved, they might come to us.
Yeah.
So it's not pitching too hard. It's more just focusing on ensuring they have an amazing time.
Got it. And that makes sense, right? So I can say firsthand, we've had guests on this show where we've perhaps had a chat before, we've had a chat after, we then connect on LinkedIn, or we were connected on LinkedIn anyway, and then they might see kind of the post that I put out, and then a little while later, let's say a few months down the line, they might reach out and say, hey, Sam, we're actually looking at getting a website done, or we're looking at having some SEO. And I'm sure you've had many of the same experiences, Tom, with yourself and clients, is that once you make that first connection, and as long as you kind of make the effort to do a really good podcast, make it insightful, ask them kind of great questions, have some back and forth, kind of give them that good experience after, like we said about sharing the episode and making it easy for them to promote, and you promoting them quite a lot, that comes back, which I get is kind of what you're trying to say here.
Yeah, I mean, if we take it back a little bit, if you try to understand how you form how people form bonds together, the strongest bonds form through the most roller coaster-ish of emotions. So if you think about your best friends, it's probably people that you maybe have known for a number of years, you went traveling together, or you got married to, etc., and you've been through these ups and downs. And so if you think about what you do when you run through the process of interviewing someone on a podcast, is there are these mini emotional journeys. First there's excitement when they book in, they're really excited. Then maybe half an hour before they're a little bit nervous, and they come on, they're a little bit nervous, but then they start having fun. And then at the end, they're really happy. And then you tell them how amazing they are, and they're super happy. And so this is how you form the bonds, is by going through this up and down, I find anyway. And so all you're really doing when you're running the show is you're forming bonds with people that could be buyers. And ideally, if you do it right, those bonds could turn into cash.
Yeah. Build those bonds, build those premium bonds. So should anyone that's starting a podcast that actually specifically wants to do it for their business to drive revenue long term? I guess I've got two parts to this question as it formulates in my mind. One is typically how long does it take in your experience, Tom, from show start to actually, I guess it's going to be hard to answer, but to actually getting your first client from your experience, on the basis that you're following this structure and you're inviting ideal clients to the show? And then secondly, should you focus your show, should the main metric of your show be focusing on booking kind of people that you want to build a relationship with over everything else?
I think in the short term, you just want to track how many people have come on the show that could be potential customers or partners. What percentage of guests could be that you bring on? And depending on how much you need that short-term ROI, then that will be closer to 100%. In terms of time, let's just say you're running you run a show for 6 months. It's a bi-weekly show, so you have 12 guests. Say 80% of them could be customers or partners. That leaves you with 10 people that you've shown an amazing experience with, you've formed the bond with. From those 10, assuming you have a product that actually solved the problem that they have, then I would ideally want to see you move into a partnership or sales conversation with one of them. That's probably a reasonable thing to expect, I would say.
Over what space of time was that?
It's a 6-month period for a bi-weekly show. So I think I got the maths right.
Got it.
So 6 times 2,
Yeah, makes sense. And then were you saying some of those kind of prospects you might have had on the show, if you think that there is a good fit, you might reach out to them a few months after the show and just say, look, we discussed this. I think your company could perhaps benefit. Is it worth the conversation? That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. All right. I think the only other thing I wanted to ask, Tom, I think the only thing we haven't covered on podcasts is just a quick one on sponsorships. What are your thoughts? Because I know someone actually put in the question section, what should be the process in getting a sponsorship with a show? Is that something you should even consider when you're doing what we've discussed, or should that be a later thought?
I think it is valuable because you can then take those funds and reinvest back into production or into promotion. I typically don't recommend going out to find sponsorship. It's just another thing to do. If you get someone inbound and you can close them on a deal that's exclusive and quite nice, then I would recommend that. But in the early days, I'd rather focus the time, instead of running a sales process to get sponsorship, I'd really focus the time on making the podcast better and making sure you're getting the guests right.
Yeah.
But if someone comes inbound and you have 200 downloads a month and they're offering you $1,000 a month, well, you can close them on $1,000 a month because it's going to be exclusive. You're going to tag them in all the LinkedIn posts, etc. Then I do take that. I recommend taking that. And I've also done that on my show with a company called HRS. We'll talk about my show in a minute. Because just for that reason, if they pay $400 a month, I don't have that many downloads, and I just take that money and I spend it on ads for the show.
Nice. Yeah. All makes sense. Thanks very much for coming on the show, Tom. Really enjoyed chatting all things podcasts and how to drive revenue with your show. So please do tell us more about how everyone listening or tuning in can learn more about your company and the best way to connect with you and get in touch.
Yeah, sure. So search for Tom Hannah on LinkedIn and you can add me in. If you have any questions about podcasting, then please ask them there. Fame.so is we run podcasts for B2B companies. So that's where you can go to find that. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say this, Confessions of a B2B Marketer is my podcast where I just have conversations about this kind of stuff with other people.
Nice one, man. And with that, Tom, thanks once again for coming on, sir.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Cheers, man.